Thank you very much, Bill. Hi, everybody. It's great to be back again at the North County chapter of the San Diego World Affairs Council. I've spoken here many times over the years, and it's always an interesting and exciting opportunity. Indeed, I'm most of my time is now president of the San Diego World Affairs Council, um, but I keep my eyes open on Russian affairs in a significant way. People say that you should always start a presentation with a joke or something funny. And really the joke is that I'm going to attempt to describe Russia's wartime economy in an hour. That is silly, but I'm going to give a run at it. And I'm doing this because the American audience, Western audience, are profoundly misinformed, really poorly informed. And what's even worse is that our governments are busy dishing out this misinformation. Part of it's propaganda, but the bigger part of it is just willful ignoring of reality. And the first whiff of this has been the last administration, but even going back before that, and that was bad enough out of the world of progressive politics and a media that is more involved in moral clarity than actual professional journalism. And now we have a new bunch in DC, Trump 2.0, and it's really hard to believe, but they're even worse. So, what you do with what you hear today, that's up to you. But this is the real deal. So first, take it forward a slide. Yeah. So what I'm going to do today is just in brief, I'm going to talk about the current economic conditions in Russia, current financial conditions. I'll take a look at what the Russian central bank outlook is. It's a very professional organization. We'll take a look at the Russian federal budget. Take it back a slide, please. Russian energy and commodity exports, I'll touch on it. And I'll talk a little bit about the Trump effect, and then what you ask in terms of questions will be really, really helpful to drive this forward afterwards. Next slide, please. All right, so this is a graphic of what's known as a purchasing managers index. This is a common tool used in economic analysis here in the United States and countries all over the world. And what it is a directional snapshot of economic activity in a particular country. The yellow line is for manufacturing. The red line is for services. And then the composite line is the blue one. The war started in the end of February 2022, and that resulted in a real shock to the Russian economy. Okay. And since then, there's been this narrative that the Russian economy is about to collapse, and that they're going to come after Putin, et cetera, et cetera. But the main deal is that the Russian economy is about to collapse. It's any time, any moment. What's taken place over the last 2.5 years is a boom. First, you have a powerful manufacturing boom, and that's defense. That's military manufacturers. But 2/3 of the Russian economy is services, just like it is here. It's more than haircuts, but it's the full gamut of service economy. And that is a reflection of the well-being of consumers, household consumers in Russia. Very strong conditions. The biggest issue facing the Russian economy today is actually a shortage of people. Everybody is looking for workers. Everybody. Let's take it forward. Okay, here we go. So this is a look at the polling of unemployment expectations. And this goes back to 1997, toward the end of the really dark era in the Russian economy. You can see the shock of 2007, 2008 financial crisis, Great Recession, was a global affair and hit the Russian economy quite hard, particularly the corporate sector. What's happened during this war period has been unemployment expectations have collapsed essentially to the lowest since the breakup of the Soviet Union. This is not a sign of economy that's about to go into collapse. Okay. This is a look at the Russian Consumer Sentiment Index. Okay, here in the United States, you hear about the Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, and there are others. The high point, this goes back to 1993, really ugly times. This is the full post-Soviet Russia perspective. The high point being just in advance of the 2007, 2008 financial crisis. Big shock there. Big shock with the that first episode of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the seizure of Crimea, the first waves of sanctions from the West. Here's the war. Consumer index, pretty close to a record high right now. Again, this is hardly a sign of an economy that's in a weakening condition. A week ago, a friend of mine, scientist at the Far Eastern Academy of Russian Sciences, she's a marine biologist. She studies algae and came here to the United States as part of a group a professional tour that I organized. I did 15 of those of young professionals. Went out to Scripps, met with people like Walter Monk, et cetera. First-rate professional. She's gone to Sakhalin Island for a ski trip. Okay, first of all, what's happened in the last 20 years is the slow development of a domestic tourism sector in Russia. At the end of the Soviet Union, there was none. I mean, it was pretty rustic, and anybody that wanted to have a good time went abroad. But that's changed. And with the war and the inability of Russians to freely travel abroad, and it's as much by restrictions abroad as it is by issues at home. And the difficulties are more actually with Western welcome, if you will. There's just been the domestic demand for tourism, instead of being focused abroad, has been focused domestically. And so she's talking here. This is an Instagram post that just popped. This is a little over a week ago. And she's talking about the prices that she experienced this from 2021 to today. Okay, and you figuring that it's 100 rubles to $1. You're looking at $200 to fly from Vladivostok to Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk and come back. And that's kind of like a trip to Portland or maybe Seattle, something like that. Fly over the Sea of Japan. Basically, when you go through this entire list, everything is increased about double. Interesting. Not me. So this, another takeaway out of this is, whoops. She mentions that this is inflation, but the tenor of this message is important. This is an observation, maybe a little bit of annoyance. Yes, this is a young professional. But, scientists are not exactly rich business people, but decent, making a decent living. This is a person that is making an observation that might be verging in toward annoyance. But not seriously so yet. Okay, but noticing that the prices really jumped. So, in urban Russia, this consumer boom, particularly places like Moscow, and I would definitely mute all, please. Down here on the bottom to the left. Mute all. It's on the bottom in the middle. You won't. Anyways, so the consumer class, the middle class, is doing quite well. This is at a park in upscale Moscow. And it's in the middle of the war. Uh, so there is a war going on. Everybody knows there's a war going on. Um, but for most people, it's more than just going about business as usual. Business as usual, life as usual has been pretty good, especially when they look back to the 90s, and that's the older people. These folks don't remember at all. They all grew up in the Putin era. That's pretty an easygoing group. And if you don't trust me on this, then that's fine. Go on YouTube and just go around and look at the videos of people that are traveling in Russia, Russians that are trying to make a living, developing a social media presence, YouTube, Instagram, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to see this. Pretty much everybody. And you look in the background of videos and photos and look at the material conditions, and you're going to see that things are pretty good. Okay, advance me a slide, please. Okay. So inflation, after the shortage of workers, which is reflected very much in inflation, the Russian central bank, which is a purveyor of hard money of the first order, always has been and is always will be. The reaction to inflation, so this is during the 2014 sanctions shock, big inflation jump. This is during the COVID crisis. And now this is the Russian central bank responding to inflation being driven by this economic boom, by labor shortages, essentially by too much government spending for the war, but also to support the economy, because they're trying to do guns and butter both at the same time. Some of you will probably remember that from the Johnson era in Vietnam, trying to do both at the same time. It's resulted in a big surge of inflation. And the reaction of the central bank in Russia has been to jack up interest rates. 21% is like the Fed. That's like the discount rate for Russia. And it has held now for 3 bank meetings. But looking here at the expectations, this is prognosis, this is the forecast for this year and for next year. The expectation is that these towering interest rates, because the inflation rate is running around 10, 11%, real interest rates are on the order of 10 or 11%. There's nothing like it on the planet. And what this does is it sucks money out of the economy. It makes it very difficult to invest. And it is going to put a squeeze on the Russian economy in 2025 and 2026. So those big growth numbers are going to disappear, and growth is going to look relatively weak. But this is like forging metal. This drives productivity. It is ruthless. I mean, if you are borrowing as a company to make an investment, but most business in Russia in the consumer sector, it's cash business. I mean, they use cards, but it's cash business. So the companies are not involved in credit so much. You'll see credit used in working capital for retail, for example, and wholesale, and it is a factor. But for what this is doing is it's sucking cash. It's squeezing the economy, which is what high interest rates do here. You know, when the Fed jacks up interest rates to drive down inflation, they squeeze the economy. The same thing is going on in Russia right now. This is another look at it. So we were just looking at the interest rates, this blue line. Very, very tight credit conditions right now. This is looking at inflation. It says here 9.9 and all. This is year on year. So this smooths out the noise of month to month variability in inflation. I mean, you get that here. So they are smoothing it out, looking over year. So inflation is still quite strong in Russia. But the difference between the inflation rate and the interest rate, this is the real cost of money, is towering. I mean, there's nothing like it on the planet. Here in the United States, it's 1, maybe 2% real interest rates in the post QE era. So in 2024, the Russian economy, GDP growth was 4.1%. This is not a country that's going into the tank. The year before, in 2023, the GDP growth was 3.6%. It was really interesting that in September last year, the IMF, after having initially misread where things were going in the Russian economy, wanted to send a delegation, having come around to understanding better what was going on there. They wanted to send a delegation into Russia to further understand what was going on in the economy. And the reaction from European governments and from the US was to stop the delegation from going. So what's with that? This is a gesture. This is a political gesture to something. What it was a willful desire to remain ignorant and make some sort of a political gesture. And when you do that at the level of the IMF, that's like dumping professionalism. You know, I'm not, to me, what, you know, it's up or down. I'm just calling it as I see it. Okay. You deserve that. Okay. And that's what the public deserves, and they're not getting it. So inflation on quarter to quarter is pretty high. But I come back to the interest rates. This is the peak. It's 21%. These numbers are going to come down. Expectation in 2025 is going from somewhere between 10, 11, 12, down to 7 to 8, down to 4 in 2026. And that's the target. These projections are built on using the announced parameters of fiscal policy from the Kremlin. So what kind of money is going to get spent on the war? What's going to get spent on social spending? What the price of oil is going to be? Things like that. And if there's changes in spending on the war, okay, we'll calculate differently. If there are changes, if the oil price goes substantially negative from what the expectation is, we'll adjust to that. But we're going to look at just what the role of energy is in the federal budget coming up. All right, just going to go quick. This is online. This is Russian Central Bank, and it's in English. So, it's not that hard to get this information. Now, you're welcome to not trust it, and good luck to you on it. This is the real stuff. In terms of information that comes out of Moscow, it's the really detailed stuff that has been restricted. The broad brush data is unrestricted. And this is relatively broad brush, but whoops. Again, inflation expectations looking ahead for several years. 4% for Russia is not too bad. We might accept it here. The interest rates will come down. This squeeze will come to an end over the next couple of years. So this difficult period that's going to come in 2025, 2026 is going to fade away. The expectation, okay, so last year GDP growth 4.1, a powerful year, one of the might be the highest in the OECD measure, the G20. India is the next economy of consequence that is growing fast. The U.S. is, running a budget deficit of 6.5 towards 7% of GDP at peacetime in an economic, almost a boom here. We'll get to that a little further. But looking forward, the growth in Russia is the economic growth is going to fade quite significantly. These aren't bad numbers. It's just a lot slower, and it's a much more sustainable outlook economically, given the resource constraints of labor um, and uh, and overall productivity. Consumption, this is households, 5.5% last year. Okay, that's considerably better than here. It's all relative, of course. It'll come down quite a bit. I'm going to move forward. On this one, there's a lot of data. The one that really matters, I would say, is oil price for tax purposes. Everybody thinks that Russia's a gas station, things like that, right? So the expectation is that 2025 at $65 a barrel, 2026, 2027 down to 60. Okay, so this morning, Urals blend, which is one of the big Russian crude, not just an index, but it's a particular type of crude oil. It's $68 a barrel. Oil prices are weak right now worldwide, so there's still room to work with here to get to 65. But it just so happens that $60 a barrel is the Western sanctions cap that Russia can use any tanker and insurance facilities available in the open market without having to use the dark fleet that they've created to try to avoid sanctions. At $60 a barrel, they're able to do business, both hands on top of the table, no games played. All right, so social sentiment index. Going back to 1995, after all these numbers here, both in terms of growth, in terms of household well-being, the spending and all, it's at the highest it's been since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. These are broad indexes. Okay, if people are ticked off, and you don't have to, when you answer something like this, you don't have to say, well, I like Vladimir Putin or I don't like Vladimir Putin. These are not political inquiries. Okay, so going to the wartime budget and spending it all. So just for reference, the spending on military has soared from the war. It's doubled. And now estimate is around 40% of Russian federal spending is on the war. It's around 7 to 8% of GDP. The Kremlin's been really reluctant to make cuts in social programs. They've been really interested in doing guns and butter. So national spending has soared. That the government spending has soared, both for the war and by and large, they've maintained spending for social programs, health, pensions, education, infrastructure. This spending is coming under pressure as the economic squeeze begins to develop. In the West, okay, so the budget revenues are pretty strong. The highest category for taxes, income taxes in Russia is 22% now. That's been raised from a band of 13% to 15%. Income taxes. So now if you're amongst the really wealthy, you're facing 22%. It's a significant increase. What I've been trying to get across to people here, decision maker types, is that, and this point that, well, we'll just squeeze Russian energy earnings, and that means that the Kremlin will have less money to spend on the war, and we'll weaken the military machine, and we'll make the environment for negotiation more in favor of the West, more in favor of Ukraine. What was never grasped was the ability of domestic Russia to increase its domestic tax take. So the biggest tax inside Russia is value-added tax. That's the biggest. That's before you get to petroleum stuff, which is number 2. And then you get income taxes, which are number 3. And now it's around 80% of revenue. It's coming up to 80% of revenue going into the Kremlin coffers is civilian tax take, value-added taxes, income taxes, and 20%. It's come down to where it's 20% is now on energy. So, you know, this is a country and a population that does pain really well. Okay. We don't. We're wimps. Just to be honest. Another identifier is that, you know, if we're squeezed in this country for whatever reason, you know, the economy has gotten bad, tax take has gone down, well, we can borrow. Okay, we're really good at borrowing in the United States. What's happened in the post-Soviet era was no borrowing. Very, 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 very limited. Currently, the Russian government debt, 13%, 13.6% of GDP is the end of the year 2024. We're at 122, 124% of GDP in the US. We're running deficits in peacetime in an economic boom of 6.5% to 7%. And if the economy heads south, we could see budget deficits in the US really take off, which is something that's not talked about much yet. Yeah, they can do bonds, special war bonds, like we've done in World War II here. They haven't gotten to that. There's a lot of stuff that can be done to raise money at home. And with those towering interest rates pulling in money out of the economy into the banking sector, because if you have a bank deposit, you're making a lot of money. And at essentially no risk. So the Kremlin is able to take advantage and access that liquidity in the banking system. So this, let's see if it's here. Alexandra Prokopenko, she's in the West now. She is at Carnegie, and she worked at the central bank. And if you ever happen to, I definitely recommend it. Actually, if you'd spend some time on YouTube, find the Carnegie Russia YouTube page and just watch some of those videos. They're very sharp people. They're here. They don't owe anybody anything. They're not, you know, protecting a family at home, and they're not kissing somebody's butt here. And the deal is that in terms of military manufacturing, and maybe you hear this from Bill in his presentation, in terms of military manufacturers, there is some pressure growing on vehicles. But in terms of drone warfare, which is really what hit that's where things are at in the Russia-Ukraine war. I mean, that is the crucial element. Both Ukraine and Russia have plenty of capacity to expand their drone manufacturing, and that's where the technology, the innovation is taking place in Ukraine and in Russia in terms of drone innovation. Yeah, the Turks are playing some pretty good stuff. You spend time looking into what's going on in the U.S., and you will find, you know, a company like Anduril, for example, is wanting to get into this space. You know, and the drones that the Russians and the Ukrainians are doing, they're using parts from China. So yes, you can say, well, the Chinese are supporting the Russian war. But those components are available. I mean, that's where the Ukrainians get their components as well. So the Russian economy is not going bankrupt, is doing relatively well, and they're in a position to the Kremlin based, standing on this economic base is well positioned to continue this war for the foreseeable future. Okay. A couple years at least. Can you take me one slide forward, please? Now, this looks like a bit of a noisy graph. This is the Russian federal budget on a monthly, I believe actually it's quarterly. But this orange shows the role of oil and gas revenue in the federal budget. And you can see the federal budget is soaring. This is domestic revenue. This is non-oil and gas revenue. Okay. And if you eliminated oil and gas, you have set back the budget. But let me tell you, you can borrow. Okay. If the whole oil and gas sector was ripped out and tossed into the ocean, so this is annual budgets, what they're spending, and the revenue. The war is on. Spending, revenue, spending, revenue, spending, revenue, spending, revenue. These are the annual government deficits. Like everywhere in COVID, big deficits. Everybody ran huge deficits during COVID. During the war. So where's the financial pressure? There isn't any. Not of consequence. If you remember back to even World War II, the United States was running enormous deficits. They were financed. Okay. The Russians are really doing guns and butter at the same time. Yeah, they're doing terrific interest rates, but it's eye-opening. It's eye-opening. But in looking at this, in peacetime, the United States is running a deficit of 6.5 to 7% of GDP. What happens if we're at war? What happens if we have an economic crisis? Okay. Now, if the Russians have a real, well, I'm not going to get into ifs and buts here. Okay. Commodities. Okay. I'm going to try to cover the whole Russian wartime economy in an hour. And so people do want to know what's going on in the oil and gas sector. And that's a reasonable thing. Going back to the high point in the Soviet Union was 11 million barrels a day. And then when the Soviet Union broke up and there was this revolution and an economic crisis that's beyond anything that anyone in this room has experienced. And I'm comfortable in saying that. If anybody's from abroad, let me know. 11 million barrels a day. Whoops. So in the late 90s, essentially with the arrival of Putin and stability in the Russian political and economic sphere after the 1998 crisis, Russian production revived. You could see the impact of COVID. This shortfall here is really about OPEC Plus attempting to limit production. And actually, this goes back to when the Saudis and the Russians were about to have a price war, and Donald Trump stepped in and worked a deal. Well, ultimately, that deal required the Saudis and the Russians to keep several million barrels of oil a day off the market. And so that's that's what's going on here. But the overall sector is in pretty good shape, and there's actually some cheating going on. Okay. This bit of a noisy graph. This is looking at the entire period of the war from 2022 to today. This showing these are seaborne shipments. Russia sends to China by pipeline about 800,000 barrels a day, 600,000 through the East Siberian Pacific Ocean pipeline, and another 200,000 to 300,000 through Kazakhstan. Pretty stable. So much for sanctions. Okay, that was a volume. That was the number of barrels. Well, we're interested in what the value is, right? In terms of the amount of money that the Kremlin or the Russia economy generates from it. So, and oil prices are down worldwide from where they were when the war broke out. But generally speaking, the earnings have held up pretty good. And again, this is seaborne earnings. This is a very noisy graph. And it includes Iran and Russia. In particular, I want to point to this here. U.S. secondary sanctions have been very effective against Russia, against countries that were trading with Russia, in particular China. The Chinese companies, Chinese banks in particular, are really uninterested in losing access to dollar finance. Okay. Even if not one transaction with the Russians is in dollars and they're all in yuan or in rubles, the effect of the sanctions has been pretty hard hitting. And so much of the last few years, a lot of the Russians have developed what's called a dark fleet. These are old tankers, not using Western registries, not using Western insurance. So the last set of sanctions that came on as Biden was heading out the door really put a spanner into Russian exports to both China and to India. And there was a great deal of crude that built up at storage at sea, tankers loaded and floating, but not going to anywhere in particular yet. Next slide, please. It's really good. Now, that period of buildup of storage at sea has clearly come to a stop as imports have resumed in India. And it's not about Russian export stats, it's about Indian import stats. And these are statistics gathered by from customs and by international information and consulting organizations. One thing that definitely has hit Russian refined fuel exports and deliveries inside Russia has been a drone warfare by Ukraine against refineries around Russia. Most of these attacks have resulted in spectacular fires like this one, which is a storage tank. And actually, in the refinery business, losing a storage tank is not really that big of a deal. I mean, it's not cool. It's very costly, but it's very different than losing the refining machinery itself. And for the most part, these drone attacks have resulted in minimal impact on refined fuels production in domestic Russia. What has come up here a couple times in the last 2 months is the Ukrainians are going after pumping stations on pipelines. There was a pumping station on the CPC pipeline. It's a Caspian. Essentially, it's how Chevron exports from Tengiz and Kashagan fields in Kazakhstan over to the Black Sea, the Russian port of Novorossiysk, and then that's Kazakhstani oil. It's not Russian oil, but it comes out of a Russian port. The Ukrainians did hit a pumping station on that pipeline, and that I think was very likely a warning to Washington that DC needed to pay attention to what was going on. And then yesterday or the day before, Ukrainians hit using drones a power substation that's delivered electricity to a pumping station on what's called the Druzhba oil pipeline, which still continues to deliver oil to Hungary and Slovakia and Eastern Europe. They don't have access to oil maybe coming in from the Adriatic or someplace. They're still isolated from global markets and are dependent on oil from Russia, although Kazakhstan can get oil into the Druzhba pipeline. But interestingly, they also this particular pumping station is at a fork where one part of the pipeline goes up to the Russian port of Ust-Luga on the Gulf of Finland, and that's an important export to the global market for the Russians. So that was a smart hit, and I'm interested in finding out how serious the damage was to that substation and how quickly it can be repaired or not. So there is an aspect of drone warfare that can have a material effect on Russian hydrocarbon sector. It's worth paying attention to and keeping in mind. This is a look at fossil fuel trade from Russia into the world: coal, crude oil, LNG, refined oil products, and pipeline gas. It's a European organization. They do good work. It's really weird that the number of shipments. I don't understand why they do that, but the graphs are what I'm interested. That the markets are what I'm interested in. So, in terms of Russian coal, which is radically reduced in terms of export overall, it's still going to China significantly, to India and to Turkey, South Korea. I'll come back to this in a second. Crude oil, for the Russians, their two primary markets now are China and India. No longer the European Union. Turkey's a significant player. LNG, despite the closure of pipeline exports from Russia to Europe, or European imports of natural gas through pipelines. Got it. Yep. The European Union still is the primary market for Russian LNG. The Europeans are really struggling with how to deal with this. They are already heavily dependent on the United States, and what all has transpired geopolitically in the last month really has the Europeans thinking about to what degree they can depend on the United States, not just physically, but in terms of relationship. The level of trust is completely out the window. Oil products are a big deal. The Russians export around 2.5 million barrels a day of refined products: diesel, gasoline, etc. Pipeline gas. They do send a considerable amount to China. Nothing like they were sending to the EU, and this is now going through a pipeline, a double pipe through under the Black Sea to Turkey. One line actually curls up to southeastern Europe, the EU, Europe. Let's see. I did want to mention about coal. So one of the effects of the war was that Europe stopped trading with Russia as much as possible in terms of both exports and imports. And a lot of that trade was done by rail. It was also done by truck, containerized. But the big coal exports from Russia used to go to Europe. That ended. And those coal production was coming out of central Russia, the Kuzbas, like Western Siberia. As the Russians' source for imported, manufactured, and consumer goods switched to China, those containers were coming into Russian Far East ports and not only maxed out the capacity of the Russian Far East ports, maxed out the capacity of the Russian rail network. Containers are nice, profitable items for rail and for ocean carrying. It's a real good way to make money, and because the value of the products in containers are relatively high. Coal is a low value commodity. Really boring. It takes a lot of space, and the rail companies don't make a lot of money out of it. And what's happened is that Russian coal exports have been squeezed out. That those central Western Siberian coal exports have been shut down because they can't get access to the rail. So there's huge building trying to go on to expand Russian infrastructure capacity. But those interest rates are a real headache for rail construction and for infrastructure, private, corporate infrastructure, because the low rates of return and the cost of money being so high, they're screaming. And this is a big issue in terms of Kremlin politics these days. Can you take me forward a slide? This is pipeline gas has collapsed. You can see the effect of imports into Europe, and that's, as of now, the only gas coming into the European Union is coming through Turkey from Russia. Okay, next. So this is a map of where things flow. You got Russia, Germany, Poland. This is the Nord Stream pipeline. Okay, two, there's Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2. When Nord Stream was attacked, the two strings of Nord Stream 1 were blown. Nord Stream 2, one string was blown twice, leaving the other string available. It was never certified, but the infrastructure is there. And in theory, there could be pipeline gas from Russia going into Germany. We'll see. The politics are really ugly for that right now. Currently, gas is coming into Turkey under the Black Sea, Blue Stream line direct to Turkey, and then this is Turk Stream, one line coming north into southeastern Europe and the other to Turkey. This is commodities. Okay. And this is too far for what we're doing today, but I decided to leave this in for a couple reasons. One, in terms of potash, the fertilizer is K, P, and nitrogen, essentially. And so we have problems with the Russians and their neighbor Belarus, essentially in the same pocket. But we're busy messing with the Canadians, right? What the heck is going on with that? Is anybody in DC actually really paying attention to this? This will not get fixed anytime soon. I don't care how much money you throw at it. I don't care how many press conferences you hold. Okay. This is agriculture, a quick snapshot agriculture over the, Russia historically has been a big wheat exporter. Russian agriculture is a serious thing. It is a private sector driven thing now. Yes, some state companies have crept back in, but this is private sector stuff. And the weather has been really tough. And this is an issue for the Russians. Their grain exports are really falling off. And it's not just wheat, it's just all different kinds of ag exports. This is a warning. This is a weather map looking ahead for the spring of this year. And the forecast is not a good one for agriculture in the European Union. This is bad for the Ukrainians, but it's also bad for the Russians and for the Kazakhstanis as well. This is going to be a really rough year for the wheat and ag grains, sunflower seed, you name it. This is going to be a tough year. Trump effect. Okay, so the general public perceives the ruble as kind of like a worthless paper. Well, that would be a mistake. And this is looking back over many years. This is back to 2020. You can see the effect of the war, the financial shock there. You can see the recovery was really nutty. This has to. There's a lot of noise in terms of cash flow into the country and out of the country, both in terms of domestic financial regulations in Russia that were meant to constrain cash flowing out of the country, but also the West trying to constrain cash flowing into the country, and for Western businesses trying to get their money out. What's really interesting is that since Donald Trump has come into office, the ruble has strengthened against the dollar 20%. That's a big number. 20%. So, okay, this is against the dollar, right? This is a closer look, as a very shorter period from this spring of 2024 to this is a couple days ago. So as of this morning, it was 84 rubles to the dollar. When Trump took office on January 20th, it was 102. That's a big change. I think a lot of it is sentiment, but that's a big change. It gets really interesting, though, when you look at the Chinese yuan exchange rate with the ruble. Same thing. What's with that? Okay, so what this is saying, this is the signal of Russian financial strength. I mean, if this was strictly about the dollar, you wouldn't see this kind of behavior in the Chinese yuan. Chinese yuan is the single most traded currency inside Russia now. The symbiosis between the two economies, China depends on Russia for non-politicized energy and commodity supplies, and the Russians are a huge market for Chinese manufacturers. It's the single largest market for Chinese cars in the world is now the Russian market. Half the Russian market is Chinese vehicles. Gonna jump. Yep. I'll go back. So the Russians are good at playing the Western game, the media game. Okay. And if I had $1 for every rare earth story that I've read, if I had $1, actually, I wouldn't be here. The amount of BS thrown around in this space is mind blowing. And even with Russia's got a lot of minerals available. The refining capacity for rare earths is in China. I don't care where you mine rare earths, and mining rare earths is a challenge. You can read about it yourself. And the refining is even more of a challenge because a lot of times those rare earths come combined with something called thorium, which is mildly radioactive. And in the state of California, you couldn't even, you'd have to put hazmat suits on and stuff like that. But it's a serious deal, and it was a serious thing inside China in terms of what they were going to allow Chinese companies, refining companies, what they were allowed to do and how much they were allowed to do it, because there were real pollution issues. Read the South China Morning Post, Hong Kong. You want to understand what's going in China? Don't read the US press. You're not helping yourself. So in terms of, there's talk in DC and even in Moscow about, well, we could have maybe, Western companies, US companies will come back. Okay. If you're a US company and you sold your company to your Russian workers, your Russian managers, and just gave them the company, you can go back if you want. Now, there are a lot of issues with movement of money between the countries. All the sanctions are still there. There's a lot of hot air that's been blown around the last month, 6 weeks. Not a lot has changed except for the exchange rate. Not a lot has changed. But in terms of looking ahead for business, there might be something. The visibility on this stuff is awful. But what has definitely clear is that from the Kremlin, this is, from Putin's mouth, if you essentially sold your company to Russian workers and managers, you could come back. But if you did anything else, don't bother. One of the companies that I do think has a chance to for an opportunity is actually Exxon. And I just don't see. I mean, you could be a consumer company sending containers of air freight containers of clothes. Not a lot at stake. I mean, there's just not a lot of money at stake. You fly in, fly out. Getting your money out is a different story. But in terms of consumer goods, I could see it happening. Manufacturers, no, just not going to happen. But in the energy sector, it could. And in the north of Russia, one of the most interesting projects of the last decade, offshore, and the Russians don't do deep water oil and gas well. No pun intended. This is a bridge too far technologically for them at this point still. They're working on it, but Exxon has it. And this Leningradskoye field, these two gas fields here, it's around 5 trillion cubic meters. This is like everything that's available in the Permian and the Haynesville shale and all. The scale of these fields and the Yamal is fantastic. Okay. And the company called Novatech has been building, private company, really well run private company, has been building LNG facilities, one here and then this the Yamal LNG, which I've talked about before, and I'll talk about this summer at a presentation at UC San Diego. A second Arctic LNG2 has been totally shut down because of sanctions. But the opportunity for the Russians to expand their LNG sector, if the sanctions allow for it, and they do not yet, these fields, Exxon was already there and was participating in exploratory drilling to understand what the geology was. This is where you could see something, is offshore Russia. But I will tell you that most of what's going on now is talk, a lot of talk. And I would say that I'm uneasy with it. I mean, there's a segment of, okay, so Russia is the market rules unless the state comes in and takes something. The market rules. I mean, that was, and hyper neoliberalism is reducing the primacy of the market to the idea that might is right. Well, that kind of fits the Russian environment, and it's coming here. I mean, I'm talking about this from a business perspective. My investment banking roots coming out. I don't like what I'm seeing from a business perspective. It's a pretty crappy environment emerging for investment. It's going to be a big problem to deal with going forward. But for me, as an analyst, this is what I've been dealing with. I have not enjoyed it. So I come here with data based on information. That's the deal. But up until even now, the amount of crap that I take on Twitter, or an online presentation where somebody surfaces and calls me a friend of Putin or something like that. Um, that's not the case. But the real issue that we have as a culture, as a society, is professionalism and paying attention to reality. And it's never been worse than it is now. Um, so I come here to offer you my best analysis. I don't get paid for it. But you deserve it. Okay. This is why I do the World Affairs Council. It's about creating an environment for people to make informed decisions. I mean, you all are smart people. You all have been around. And I think it's really unfortunate that you're being played with. So I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me here today. Thank you.